happy to see so many gentlemen here today.
Well, we're happy to see all these women here today.
I've been serving on a committee that increased the number of men and the number of minorities that we have in the CASA program. So I'm just glad to see increases in numbers. I'll introduce myself. My name is Cheryl Soehl, and I work at the University of South Carolina. That's my day job. I work in student life, which is where they do all the fun things, all the activities and programs in Greek life and films and speakers. And we also run the student union, which is the facility where the students kind of congregate and have their meetings. That's my day job. I have another job, which is part-time, which started as a volunteer commitment. In 1989, I started volunteering with Sister Care, which is the agency locally that serves battered women and their children in the 5-county metropolitan area. And I volunteered with them for quite a long time, and that kind of inspired me to go back to school. And I got my master's degree in rehab counseling in 1999. And since then, I've completed a certificate program in alcohol and drug studies, and I'm just finishing up a certificate program in psychiatric rehabilitation, because what I found is that we have issues with battered women that are a little more intense than in the general population, issues like alcohol and drug issues, and also we have some clients that have pretty severe mental illness, especially post-traumatic stress disorder, which often arises from these situations. So anyway, I've been a guardian for 8, 9 years, maybe 10. I'm not sure.
It's all right.
A long time. And my first guardian case actually involved a situation where there was not just child sexual abuse, but also domestic violence. And it was not a lucky thing, but because there was evidence of police calls to the home related to domestic violence, I was able to help substantiate the case by getting the police records of those visits to the home, because the little girl in her story had talked about mom and the abuser getting in a fight over what had happened to her. And so by tracking the police calls to the home, we were able to substantiate her story and get her out of that situation, get the abuser out of the home. And I saw the mom maybe a year and a half ago. I ran into her just out in the community, and she said, you know, I want to thank you for your help. We're doing really well. My daughter's doing fine. She had a daughter and twin babies. So we were able to get her some significant help through those records. I want to talk a little bit about when we get moms and children into our shelter, Sister Care, how that works for them, and then talks about the impact of domestic violence on children. We have a 24-hour crisis line at Sister Care. Women can come in any time of the night or day, and often they do show up in the middle of the night because they've been chased out of their home or run away with their children and don't have anywhere to go. When they get to us, we do a first brief intake, which collects demographic information, name, address, contact information, a little bit of medical history, a little bit of information about the children, information about their legal status. They may have charges pending themselves for one reason or another. We talk to them about their immediate emotional state to make sure that they're not suicidal or having suicidal thoughts. We collect all that information right away, and then a couple of days later we do an intensive intake with the women that's related to their abuse experience, and we collect a lot more information at that time. We also do an intake for children. We have a full-time children's counselor that works in the Richland shelter, and there's a children's counselor that works in the Lexington shelter as well. That's really necessary because kids that are coming into shelter are often immediately traumatized by being pulled out of their home, but they're also sometimes suffering from the long-term effects of witnessing domestic violence or being victims of abuse themselves. So we do a lot of work down some information. This first handout is titled Domestic Violence Concerns for Guardians. There's 15 copies of it. I don't know how many I didn't count. If we don't have enough, we can maybe make some more copies. So I'm just going to run through this pretty quickly. I don't want to bore you because I want to give you time to ask some questions. Chances are, if you've had a case already, the likelihood that there is domestic violence in the family you're dealing with is pretty high. 35 to 45% of the cases also involve a parent being battered. 60% of children in a 1988 study of women entering battered women's shelter had also been abused by the batterer. And that's something that's really important to remember, is that if the mom is being abused, the chances of the child also being abused are much higher than if mom is not being abused. So keep that in mind. If domestic violence is something that comes out early in the case, you need to really, the safety level for the children goes down incrementally with the severity of the abuse on the mom. 10 to 15% of domestic violence homicides, the batterer also kills one or more children. I have a collection which is awful, but I can't stop collecting these stories. I started a couple of years ago collecting news stories off the internet of murder, suicides, and domestic violence incidents, and I've got probably between 350 and 400 of these saved on the disc. And someday I'll do something with them. I have a lady that went through it, that's interested in this too, and was interested in maybe doing a study on it. But oftentimes when the batterer decides to kill his spouse, he's suicidal. He's going to take himself right along with mom. And unfortunately, in a number of these cases, the children are also victims. And other innocent bystanders who may be in the area when the incident occurs may be victims as well. And we've had one or two already this year in South Carolina. We had an incident of the little girl and the mom who were shot. When we get these murder-suicides, the next step would be the abuser, of course, goes ahead and kills himself as well. This guy didn't commit suicide, but it wouldn't surprise me to find that he was actively suicidal when he tried himself dead. There's a really horrible case in Florida a couple of years ago. A man was just so angry with his wife over the divorce and custody of the battle they had, and he picked up his children. I think he had 3 or 4 kids, and picked them up for a visitation. And he took 2 of the children, cut the throat of one child, and took both children, threw them in a lake, and then took the other 2 children with him on the interstate and purposely drove his car into a tractor trailer truck. Killed all 3 of them, and I think maybe one of those children survived. This was a horrendous incident. And what really gets to me is that afterwards, invariably someone will say, "This is so awful, we just never saw this coming." Well, I'm here to differ with that opinion. Most of the time in these cases, there were indicators in advance. There was prior contact with social services. There were protective orders in place. There were a lot of ways in which there could have been an effective intervention. It didn't happen. So I want you to keep that in mind, that the risk of death for a child in that situation may not be tremendously high, but when it happens, I think it's almost always in some sense preventable if the family had gotten the right kind of advance. So I know why we're all here and why we do this is we want to help kids and we want to protect them and save their lives. So it's important to look at the domestic violence issue pretty carefully. Battered moms have 16% higher rate of alcohol and or drug abuse, and we see this in shelter. Lots of moms are actively addicted, or they use alcohol to cope. And oftentimes, if they get out of the battering situation, they can tremendously reduce their consumption of alcohol and drugs. Oftentimes, if we can problem solve with them, get their children cared for while they're in treatment, they will agree to go to treatment, and we can help them in that way to get them out of the situation that causes them to use, and then help them and help their children get them into treatment program. Where the mother is assaulted by the father, daughters are exposed to a risk of sexual abuse 6.51 times greater than girls in non-abusive families. That makes sense when the daughters controlling everyone, oftentimes the daughters are the target. In homes where domestic violence occurs, children are physically abused and neglected at a rate 15 times higher than the national average. So, domestic violence, if you have that in a family situation, all the indicators for all kinds of issues go up. So what does it do to children to experience domestic violence? It can have emotional, behavioral, structural effects. Witnessing violence can have adverse effects on children's physical, cognitive, emotional, and social development. And there are studies now which have proved that exposure to violence and or serious neglect in children can have structural impacts in the brain. In other words, the parts of the brain that react to situations that would engender fear or anxiety are changed. And sometimes the change in those structures is permanent. So little children as young as a few months old can actually have the rest of their lives impacted by the presence of violence in their homes, by the chaos and the fear that engenders. Important way to head off trouble for everybody in the larger community. Okay, infants and toddlers can be excessively irritable. Their behavior lags, developmentally they lag behind other kids. They have sleep disturbances, emotional distress, regression in toileting and language. And that's kind of a big one. We see that a lot in shelter if the child is around the age, toddler age, where they should have been toileting themselves, and they made some progress in that. They may regress to an earlier stage. Reduced autonomy and exploratory behavior, that is, children are less likely to be curious and explore their environment. They'll be clinging to mom, not actually moving out away from mom and then with some children, the opposite is true. They become excessively active and unable to control themselves. They're just bouncing off the walls. Depends on the child and what that child's personality is, how they respond. School-age children, again, sleep disturbances, with child abuse, they can have bedwetting, with domestic violence, the same things occur. Restriction in play and exploration, difficulty paying attention, concentration, worry, separation anxiety, and school phobia. I do a presentation for a class Dr. Kevin Soehl teaches people who are educators who are in the school system, and one thing I tell them to look for is if you've got a child that's falling asleep on their desk during the day, something is going on at night to keep that child from sleeping and getting the rest that they need. And often it's because dad or stepdad or boyfriend is keeping mom up all night. And it's a favorite tactic. Is about the time when mom would be getting some rest and putting the kids down. Or maybe it's because the children are in bed and he thinks, okay, now I can do what I want to do, and he'll keep mom awake half the night with threats and beatings. And children have described watching dad hold a gun on mom all night, or a knife, or have to sit and listen to what he's doing to the mother. And I say he, and I know some people are going to go, wait a minute, women can be abusive too, and that's true. And I'm not trying to minimize the fact that some women can be abusive as well, but in the people that I deal with, the people I have experience with are women, and the majority of the cases where there's serious physical injury, it's family abuse. I'm not discounting the fact that women do abuse. Kids have nightmares, fear of leaving home, anxiety, numbing of affect. It's interesting. Some of the kids who come into shelter are quiet. They don't move around much. They're very quiet. They're very withdrawn. Other kids who come in will be extremely aggressive. They'll be aggressing on each other. They'll be, like I said, bouncing off the walls. children just have different ways of reacting, so you can't say there's one characteristic way that kids will react to witnessing abuse. It depends on the child. It depends on what they see. It depends on how the child is disciplined. Oftentimes we'll get a child that comes in who's, doesn't say a word, is extremely withdrawn and quiet, and over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, we watch that child kind of open up and blossom and start responding and talking. We've got a little boy in shelter right now that the first week he was there, he'd just stare at you and his eyes would get about this big and he wouldn't say anything. And then all of a sudden he started to open up, and now when you come in, I'm there twice a week, he'll come running up, hi, and want to be hugged. So, children can recover from this. They can change, they can regain trust, but depending on how long they're in this situation, the impact can be very serious. It could take a long time for them to get over it. So again, it depends on the child. With adolescents, there's a high level of aggression or acting out, anxiety, behavioral problems, truancy, revenge seeking, restricted emotional development, and post-traumatic stress symptoms similar to soldiers exposed to war. And we find this is true with our women too, that for some of them, living with an abuser is like being in a prisoner of war camp because of the extreme level of control that is exercised by the abuser. You'll hear women talk about not being able to leave the house unescorted for years, not just once or twice, but years. This is extreme control, but it's not as unusual as people think. Having to account for their time whenever they leave the house, when they come back, they have to do recount every minute that they were away from home to satisfy the abuser that they haven't been out doing something they wanted to do. This is horrible. It sounds unbelievable, but women are actually, when they come home, subjected to panty checks, even if they've just been to the store for 15 minutes. The abuser will make them take their underwear off and check to see if they've been fooling around. The level of control that there is just unbelievable. And one of the really disturbing things about teenagers is if a child has lived with us for a fairly long time, they may at some point decide, if they get big enough and strong enough, that they may decide, this had happened. I think it's over 50% of adolescent males who are convicted of murder have trouble with their speech. So when they decide it's time for it to stop off, and they take lethal measures to make sure it doesn't happen again, which is a good reason to intervene early on so that they don't get to that point. So what does being abused do to a woman's ability to parent her children? Well, obviously, it's going to impair it to one level or another. Oftentimes, mom, in order to reduce the likelihood that the abuser will hurt the child, mom will take on the disciplinarian role with the children. In other words, she will place herself between the abuser and the kids. And she will often over-control the children or over-discipline them because she knows that if he does it, they're really going to get hurt. So she will often take on that role herself. She's going to be stressed out. Likelihood is that she doesn't sleep well, or her sleep is disturbed frequently, sometimes every night. She's in a constant state of anxiety and fear. It's hard to be a good parent when all that is happening to you. We see with women who come into shelter that the first few days they're really, sometimes they're not even paying attention to their children. They're just kind of lost in their own thoughts and trying to figure out, they're in crisis, they're trying to figure out what am I going to do next. Especially if they don't have job skills and they're not employed and they've got 2 or 3 little ones and they're thinking, oh my God, what have I done now? I left him, but he was the one who was paying the bills. How am I going to handle this? How am I going to get my housing and child care? And they're very distracted, and it's very hard for them to parent the kids. So there are a lot of reasons why it interferes with parenting. Again, they're more likely to use substances to calm themselves or to medicate themselves if they're depressed. And so that's a big issue as well. available to help with schoolwork or social problems. And then again, if they're being abused, people tend to pass it on. They may be abusing the kids because of what's happening to them. It's not an excuse for what they've done to their kids, but it is an explanation of why it's important to resolve these domestic violence issues before you can help them to change their behavior. The impact of the batterer on the family. Again, everybody keeps it inside those four walls. It's very rare for kids to talk outside the family about what's going on because they have learned early on the worst crime you can commit is to tell somebody what's happening. These family systems are often so close that nobody talks to anyone outside the family. Abusers will typically cut off contact with supportive family members, with friends, with church families. Oftentimes the woman didn't even want to go to church on Sunday because if she goes, she won't talk. She won't tell somebody what's happening. So frequently, the only contact that children have with adults other than mom and dad or mom and boyfriend is at school. And that's often where they will open up about these things. This is an interesting concept, either disrupted routines or conversely highly regimented and rigid routine. It depends on the personality of the batterer. Some batterers are just out of control and chaotic, and they're drinking and driving and unpredictable, and anything could be going on in the home. It's very chaotic. Some abusers, on the other hand, are extremely controlling, very rigid. They run their families almost in a militaristic fashion. A lot of batterers that we hear about are ex-military, law enforcement, some other area of employment where everything's very regimented. And they will dictate everything, including when everybody gets up, when breakfast is served, what is served for breakfast, how people, the order in which people get to use the bathroom, what television shows are watched, what reading materials in the home. Everything is regulated by them. Extremely rigid. And I think in some ways the people who are very regimented and rigid are when the woman tries to leave, those are the ones who really persevere and stalk and try to regain control because control is the issue with them, their power over the people, and their ability to control everything that happens in the household is their big issue. So when a woman tries to leave, very often that is the time when she's in the most danger. And the kids are in the most danger as well. So, how is this going to impact what you do? Number one, never talk to parents together if you can help it. Sometimes that's hard because the batterer is very, very controlling. He will not give you access to his partner to discuss anything. You always see them together. A lot of batterers will, if their wife goes to the doctor, we're not even talking about going to the doctor for injuries or incidents related to abuse, but any visit to a doctor, she'll be accompanied, and he'll want to stay right in the room. Doctors have gotten smart about this, and they typically don't let a batterer in the room when a woman's being examined, but it's not uncommon for them to expect that access. He doesn't want her ever to be alone, so he would like to provide support that she might confide in. So if you've got a case opening up, I would always interview parents separately if you can, just to kind of get a feel for the family dynamics and what's going on between them. If children tell you about abuse, 9 times out of 10 they are telling the truth, and I would believe them. We know, if you've been an experienced guardian, you will know that a lot of times people will say, as soon as the child opens up and starts talking, well, that child said.
What age are you speaking?
Pretty much any age, and children, even little 3 and 4-year-olds can say, Daddy hit Mommy. Well, with teenagers, sometimes teenagers make things up, but I always listen to them very carefully, and if they talk about domestic violence, I would really believe them, because what reason do they have to make that up? It's not related to them directly. And often parents have, I had a case not too long ago where both of the mother was being abused, the dad was the abuser of the teenage daughter, and both of the parents kind of closed ranks on this child. Oh, that didn't happen. Eventually, the mom left. She got herself out and started getting some help for herself. But they did close ranks, and their posture was, well, this child's not telling the truth. She's out of control. She's got mental health issues. She did have mental health issues, and a lot of them resulted from what was going on in her home. So, yeah, if a teenager tells you that, I would believe them, but then I would also want to back that up with check records. If you get a case and you're hearing things and you really can't pin it down, you can go to Richland County Sheriff's Department or Columbia Police and ask them, do you have any calls to this address? And they'll tell you. You might have to talk to 2 or 3 people, but I recommend getting with the victim advocate in those agencies, because they'll be more responsive to you and helpful when you're trying to, especially if you say, I'm trying to protect the child. What can you tell me about this address and these people? You can go online, and I've done this myself, and I pay for it myself. I go online and check people's arrest records. It only costs $8 if you're a nonprofit, so you can go online and get a lot of information and get it down.
Where about that?
On the SLED site, you can go online. There's a link to, I don't know what they call the site, but it's right on that first page. You'll see a link where you can go and check people's arrest records. And it will tell you about arrests and convictions. So if you're concerned about somebody that's in that home, or somebody that may be abusing somebody in that home, and people tend to change their story and act a little differently when they're telling you, oh, I never did anything like this, or I'm not an abuser. And they pull out their arrest record and you start asking them, what about this charge? What about this charge? What about this charge? And they're more amenable to work with you and admit they're part of what's going on. Separate legal representation. This is really important. I had a case a while back where there's definite abuse of the mom along with pretty serious abuse of the child. The child was living with her mother and stepfather. And stepfather was the father to 2 other children in the home. They since had another baby. But the little girl, when I first talked to her, was not only talking about what happened to her, but also talking about what happened to her mom. She saw her mom strangled by Dad. She and her mother and her brother had climbed out a window to get away from Dad at one point. And we tried to get to the bottom of this with the parents. The first time the parents came to court, each of them had an attorney. And at some point early on in the proceedings, one of the attorneys agreed at the batterer's insistence that she represent both of them, and the mom's attorney was discharged. Well, I made serious objections at the time. I jumped up and down and yelled and screamed and said, this is wrong, you can't do this. Don't you realize that this woman you're representing is a battered woman? I was not successful in getting that fixed. And it really complicated the case. It took a lot of digging and a lot of advocacy to protect that child. Mom stayed with Dad. As far as I know, they're still together. But this is a very abusive man. This is a guy who would, if the children didn't do what he wanted them to do, he wouldn't necessarily hit them. Although he did, he beat this child with a belt with marks on his face. He used a belt on a 18-month-old. She moved fast enough for him. He would have the children not do push-ups, but bend over and put their fingertips on the floor and stay like that for 10, 15, 20 minutes at a time. Have you ever tried to do that? It's not very comfortable. He is definitely an abuser and a very controlling person and very intimidating person. I feel badly. I know that the woman's family had tried at different times to convince her to get away from him, to leave him. And I was talking to her one day about it, and she said, well, he pays the bills. I don't have to worry about him. He pays the bills. And this was a pretty decent job, and he did pay the bills. But in return for that, he expected that when he spoke, everyone in the house would jump. I'm still concerned about that family. I think, there are a lot of eyes on that family now, so it would be hard for him to do what he did previously. But I think he's still in control of these folks. So, if you suspect that there is domestic abuse, and you see them come into court with one attorney, then I think it's your duty to speak up and object to that. The attorney on this case tried to have me removed on she was really unhappy with me, but I personally felt that what she did was unethical. And I would, if I were in the same position again, I would just go to the attorney and say, excuse me, but what you're doing is unethical, and you really need to find out if this person can get separate representation and separate yourself. Report you. And I think if it were today, I would report that person to the law. Safety assessment with the abused parent. That's important. There's some tools online that can help you do that. Some things you can download that will help you talk to the non-abusing parent about her level of safety, about some things that she can do to reduce danger for the children. Encourage you to do that. Enlist the non-abusing battered parent in efforts to protect the children. I know we have to be careful in the beginning because people are always going to deny their involvement in hurting the child. But if you really feel that there's an abusing parent and a non-abusing parent, I think that you need to really work with the non-abusing parent. That's the child's best option for the least harm, is that non-abusing parent. So I would try to provide resources, give her the number for sister care, tell her about counseling services, tell her about community support groups, let her know that she does have an option besides staying with the battery. Counseling, absolutely, everybody can use counseling. Moms, children, batterers, and I would always recommend that for kids. Even if you find that a child is not, him or herself, being physically abused, if they've witnessed violence, they need some help with that. That can be a lifelong issue for them if they don't get to sort it out. Have another caring adult that they can talk to, that's not a relative, that they can really unload themselves to is really important. This next thing I'm going to give you is there was a really important court case in New York State in the last couple of years. I don't know the date on this, but the state of New York, because people started getting interested in the impact of domestic violence on children, the social services in the state of New York decided, well, we're going to help these children. We're going to do something about this. And they started removing children from battered moms. Even when the mom was not abusive, they were removing children because they said there was a threat of harm. The outcome of this was that the children would be put in foster care, and because moms didn't know how to navigate the system or had issues themselves, which came to light because the children were doing this, moms were not getting their kids back. And children were spending long periods of time in foster care only because the mother was battered. For no other reason. They weren't abused, they weren't neglected, but because mom was being battered, social services decided, well, we're going to take these kids out of this situation and help them. I have to say this over and over and over again. The best way to help the children of an abused woman is to help her. Because the best home for a child is with a parent that loves them and protects them. Just because a mom is in an abusive situation doesn't mean that with some help and some alternatives that she could protect them and keep them safe. So I think it's real important in a situation like this. Don't put the blame on the victim, basically, which is what these cases were doing. They were re-victimizing somebody that had already been victimized by taking their children away. Yeah, you do want to make sure kids are safe, and if you think that they are at risk of harm in the home or mom's being abused, maybe the best thing would be to remove them briefly while you get some services to mom. But don't paint both parents with the same brush when you do that. Make sure that you're really seeing the big picture. And if mom is not abusing, and if mom just needs some help to get herself out of a safe situation, work with her. Spend some time with her. Get her the help and counseling that she needs.
What do you do when actually, see, I had a case several years ago. The mother and the father would fight. They weren't married to each other. They didn't live in the same home, but she'd go to him and fight, and he'd come to her and fight. And the children were always there when this was happening. Do you get restraining orders, or how do you get that?
Well, that's kind of hard, because if mom doesn't request it, a woman can get an order of protection if she has an intimate relationship with someone, if they have a child in common, even if they don't live together, she can get an order of protection. If they do live together and she decides that they need to separate, she can get an order of protection. But she's the one that has to take it. Now, I don't know, I can't think of any occasions where a guardian has said, well, we need a court order protecting these children. But if you're in family court, and you're in the review process, and this person keeps coming back, and you're fighting in front of the children, you can stipulate that in the order. No contact. You can ask for no contact, or you can enjoin them from doing things to each other in front of the kids. You could put that in a court order as far as I know. And if you think it needs to be there, by all means, speak up and say so. It's important. If what they are doing between the two of them is having an impact on the kids, then surely say so in the order. So, you're not to do this or this in front of the children. And you may at the same time be helping mom to get out of the situation. It sounds like mom was kind of aggressive too.
She was too. They were both. She'd go to his house and come to her house.
Sometimes you need to cool off, and maybe what you need is if the children are visiting with one of the other parents, that they take the children to a neutral location, document that this is happening, or that the children have said it bothers them.
Well, what they did was what I did. I got those reports from the police, because there were lots of them in 2 different counties. And I just said to them, hey, look, don't you come on this side, don't you go on that side. I don't remember whether they put it in the court order or not, but I didn't hear more from it when we closed the case out, so I guess whatever they did worked.
Well, that's very, it's useful. Anything that you think is going to be important, have it in the order. Because then, if somebody does something, they're violating a court order. It's not just somebody say so. That's why people need orders of protection. You can't hold a piece of paper up in front of you. It's not going to protect you. If somebody doesn't pay any attention to it, they can go right through that paper and get you. The importance of the order of protection is if you have one and the person violates it, then they can just automatically be arrested. You don't have to charge them with anything through the whole deal of explaining to a woman about why you get one. Because they'll say, well, if he wants to get you, honey, he's going to get you anyway. That's true. If somebody really wants to hurt you, and they have the ability to track you down, they can do that. But if you have a court order and they come anywhere close to you during the time that you have that order of protection, then they're subject to arrest. So it's a tool. It's not perfect, but it's a tool in your arsenal that you can use. Another handout for you. It's just a kind of a summary. It's called Effective Intervention in Domestic Violence and Child Maltreatment Cases. And it's got some useful information. I'm not going to go through it. You can read it yourselves. And the last thing I have to give you is some websites that you can go to and look up information related to domestic violence and child abuse. And there's just a wealth of information on the internet. I am the editor of 3 categories in Open Directory. Open Directory is it's not like the Google where you just enter a term and you can search, the entire internet. It's a list of different topics, and underneath those there are subtopics. And the 3 topics that I edit as a volunteer editor are the one on domestic violence, one on family violence, and one on child abuse. And that's listed, I think it's probably at the end of your list. Those are good places to go because it includes most of the stuff that's on this sheet anyway.
Have any states done anything legislatively that have punished children for their domestic violence bills?
Well, I think we just did that. So increasing the penalties for children who witness violence is a help. But it's not, a piece of legislation or law is not going to really solve the problem. You need a coordinated community response. Because there are things in the current law that law enforcement ignore most of the time. There's 2 provisions in the current domestic violence law. One of them says that an officer, when he arrives on the scene, may not threaten to arrest everyone in order to get control of the scene. Well, when I read the law to the women in the shelter, they all laugh at that, and they just start hee-hawing because, 9 times out of 10, law enforcement shows up at a home and people are, excitable and upset, and somebody's crying. They'll say, "All right, everybody, shut up! I'm going to take y'all to jail." That's a tool that they have that they think is going to help them to get control of the scene. Now, unfortunately, when they say that, here's a mom. She's got 3, maybe 4 little ones. He's just told her, if you talk, if you open your mouth, I'm not just taking him to jail, I'm taking you to jail too. What's going to happen to these little children? So it has the impact of immediately shutting her up. She's not going to tell the truth. She's the wheels are turning. She's thinking, well, damn, if he takes me to jail and my partner to jail and I can't get anybody to take the children, they're going to DSS and I'll never get my kids back. Boy, if you've ever wanted to shut somebody up, that did it. She's not going to talk. She's not going to open up. She's not going to tell them. She just wants him to go away. She called him because he was terrorizing her and her children, but the impact of calling the police now is she's at risk of going to jail and losing her kids. So that can encourage somebody to open up and talk now. There's another provision in the law that law enforcement routinely ignores, which is they are required by the law. It's not a judgment call. It's not something they can do if they feel like it. The law requires them, if both people are saying that the other person aggressed against them, they are required to attempt to determine the primary aggressor. And the reason that's in the law is because, lots of times you show up and, one person is saying one thing and another person is saying something else, and you have to sort it out. Because in domestic violence cases, often, a woman will fight back. She's being choked, she's going to reach up and try to scratch and get your hands off my throat, whatever. Both people may have injuries. He may be the only one bleeding. But he's bleeding because he had his hands around her throat, and she's trying to get him off of her. So they're not to make assumptions. They're to interview the parties separately and try to determine what actually happened. And then at that point, they're supposed to charge the person who is the primary aggressor. Well, what they do is they don't want to have to sort it out. I'm not doing this. First of all, they'll threaten to arrest everybody, and then second of all, if they can't sort it out, they will arrest everybody. Or they'll say to a woman, well, I can arrest him, but I'm going to have to arrest you too because he says you hurt him. And they don't make an attempt to sort it out, which is the intent of the law. So you've got a law that really is trying to make things work right, but you got law enforcement officers who are not trained well enough or not experienced enough or don't care or don't have the time. They've got another call coming. They want to get rid of the situation, so they don't follow the law.
But don't they have to arrest a woman for every domestic violence?
If there are visible injuries, yes, they do have to arrest. And sometimes that ends up being the woman who is defending herself. they don't look at everything that happens. They don't interview people carefully. And of course, they have the option of later dropping the charges if they determine that she wasn't at fault. But meanwhile, again, we've got a woman going to jail. She's got little children. What happens to the kids? So, having a law is one thing, but implementing the law properly is a more complicated issue. We need more training for law enforcement. We need more review of cases where law enforcement's responded to domestic violence. Somebody should be going back and looking at those reports and then interviewing the officers and asking them what they did. When you got to the scene, what did you do? I don't think anybody does that now. To me, the House has just said they're going to set up a committee to review domestic violence issues. I think they should be doing some reviews of law enforcement response. How did they proceed? What were the steps that they took to find out what was going on? And if they're not following the law and they're not following procedures, then train them. Make them accountable. Make sure they do what they're supposed to do.
What I've found is that there's a lot more training now for law enforcement, but it's falling down in the court system, like, with being able to have the evidence to charge them, and with people showing, obviously a lot of them don't show up, but they're just having a lot more trouble now that they've trained the officers once the women are being show up.
Well, and so, a lot of, well, things may change now that we've raised the penalties on domestic violence cases and the big felonies. But when it's a misdemeanor charge, you go to magistrate court, and magistrate judges sometimes. Well, I think they're now required to have a high school diploma. But other than that, they don't get a lot of training. John Graham Altman objected to the part of the new law that required training for judges. Well, family court judges don't need this training. Domestic violence cases don't go to family court.
Are you speaking of the one that just passed or the one that was tabled?
Well, the one that was tabled. Yeah.
The one that was tabled?
Yeah. That was requiring that judges be trained. Now it's at the discretion of, I think, the Chief Justice, what training they get. The prior bill was tested.
Wasn't there something in that law that said the judges had to go get training every year?
Yes.
Wasn't that what they were?
Well, that was part of what they were objecting to. And Altman is saying, well, family judges don't do this training. They see this all the time. Well, no, they don't. Because these cases go to magistrate court or general sessions court. Family court judges do it first.
I don't know about in this state, but in New York State, I had 2 prior cases where it was obvious that the male was the batterer, and it was done in front of the children, to this New York State law. I would slap them with additional charge, not only domestic violence, but also endangering the welfare of the minor, which puts them on a different level, not only the felony, but then you have that endangerment because you committed a violent act in front of the child, and that kept the man out of the house a little bit longer also, and it also locked in the mother whether she wanted to testify or not, maybe not on the domestic piece, but on the endangering. You have the officers that are the primary witnesses, to that aspect.
Yeah, that's a good point. Trying to talk people into after the fact that they have no charges.
But the officers can do that. The responding officers can slap that charge on the endangering.
Well, and, like you say, it depends on who's responding, what their training is, what their attitude is. Because, I don't think it's a secret that there's a higher level of domestic violence in law enforcement families than the general public. So you may have people responding to domestic violence incidents who have a personal bias against victims. It's unfortunate, but that's the real world. This article, I didn't make copies of this for everybody, but obviously if you want one, she'll get you one. Or you can email me, and I will email it to you as a PDF file. Let me give you my email address if you want to write it down on the sheet. It's hl@usit.net. And if you want, I'll email you a copy of this. But this is by a gentleman named Lundy Bancroft. If you want to read one book about this topic, his book, The Batterer as Parent, would be the book I would recommend for you to read. He's worked with batterers for like 20, 25 years. He's worked with men who batter, and he knows them inside and out, and he doesn't listen to excuses. He holds them accountable, and he has a lot of information in this book about how to deal with them and how to hold them accountable and what it's like for children to live in a household with a batterer. So Lundy Bancroft is the person I would recommend you read. And the book, The Batterer's Parent, I believe the Richland County Public Library has it. Check it out. Excellent information. And check out these links. Bruce Perry. Pretty much all of these, I think, are good links, and will take you to some good resources. The one thing I was trying to get for you today that I didn't get, and it's really aggravating, I could not find my tape. I had recorded this. There's a, and I'm not sure, I don't have the internet link for it, but if you Google it, if you search for the words Lisa, 911, and domestic violence, you can locate it and you can download and listen to this tape. It's a 911 tape. This is a little sheet about the tape, but the sheet says that the child was 6 years old. I think she was older than that. I think she might have actually been 10 or 11. But it's about a 10-minute 911 tape of a child that's called about her mother being abused. And you can hear in the background, while the child is talking to the 911 operator, you can hear the mother screaming and the stepfather yelling and carrying on. And it says it so much better than I could what the impact is on a child to have this experience. If you can get to it, I would recommend you just sit and listen to it because it is very disturbing. Oddly enough, on the same site where this tape is available, there's a 911 call for a little boy, not little, maybe around 12 years old boy who's calling. Same circumstances, there's a 911 call because someone has been hurt, but he's so calm and collected. On one hand, the little girl's hysterical and terrifying. On the other hand, this little boy is just as calm as can be. It's really, the contrast between them is really interesting. I think there are like 4 different 911 tapes that you can listen to. I would recommend that you do it because then you really get a feel for what it's like for the person that's there. Questions?
What did you say to search? You said go to Google and it's 911 and domestic violence?
And the word Lisa. I think if you put all those in, you'll find it. But it really is emotionally very difficult to listen to. And next time I do this, I'm going to have it. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions? Oh, one more thing. Write this number down. 765-9428. That's Sister Care's 24-hour crisis line. 765-9428. Keep that in your address book. If you change address books, write it down again. I guarantee you someday you will need that for something.